We will be back in Genesis once again this morning, Genesis chapter 39, looking at the life of Joseph. If you missed last week's message on Joseph, that's okay, I can give you a quick review. Long and short of it is, Joseph's brothers betrayed him and sold him into slavery. He has 11 of them, and 9 out of 11 decided that they didn't want him around anymore. So put yourself in that position, think about how you'd be feeling and thinking if 9 out of your 11 brothers decided they preferred a little bit of the silver to you. Not exactly a happy time in this young man's life. So we will pick up the story in chapter 39 of Genesis. So have you ever convinced yourself that you could get away with doing something wrong? Something you knew you shouldn't do, something you knew was wrong, but you said, you know what, I can get away with that. Or perhaps you have deluded yourself into thinking that the consequences somehow wouldn't apply to you. I know 9 times out of 10 that happens, but not to me. Somehow I'm special and it won't happen to me. Or maybe you ignored warning signs right up until the moment when the price had to be paid for your bad choices. Well, Joseph in this morning's text is going to face a situation where there are potential consequences and he has to weigh them and decide what he is going to do. And we will get to that as the text unfolds. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 39, it says, Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So he is bought in Egypt by Potiphar, a man who is the captain of the guard of Pharaoh. This is a person of serious importance. He is one of Pharaoh's trusted officials. He is the man in whom Pharaoh has placed his own life, because this man is the last line of defense to stop would-be revolutionaries. Anybody who wants to take over the throne of Egypt's got to go through Potiphar. And especially in this sort of government, anyone who would foment a coup, some relative of the Pharaoh, or someone else who thinks, you know what, I should be Pharaoh instead, Potiphar is charged with protecting the Pharaoh's life. So he would have been very well paid, because if someone is going to be in this position, you want their loyalty to be unquestioned. You want them to be your man in life and death. So he is an important person. And he probably owned many slaves. He probably had a variety of business ventures going. When you're in Pharaoh's inner circle, you become very connected and very influential. So he had a lot of that stuff going on. If we consider the options for Joseph when his brothers sold him into slavery, he could have ended up in much worse places than this. If he had been sold to work in the mines or to be a galley slave and row the ships, his life expectancy would have been very short. Those guys didn't last long. Or perhaps he might have been sold in some far province of the Egyptian Empire and never been heard from again. Instead, where we find Joseph, we find him within the hub of the ruler of the world's most powerful empire. And that is where he is. Beginning in verse 2, it says, The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. See, the Lord was with Joseph. Who is the Lord? The Lord is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And we wonder, how well did Joseph know of the Lord before he was sold into slavery? What had he learned from his father about the Lord? We don't know, because he did not have the scriptures. Joseph didn't have the scriptures to turn to, for the simple reason that the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses, and he is not going to be born for another 400 years. So certainly Joseph did not have the scriptures to consult and learn about God from. So I wonder, in what way was the Lord with Joseph? Did Joseph see visions? We know he had dreams. Did he hear God's voice? What mental and spiritual assurances did he have from the Lord? Well, whatever it was, people around him knew about this because it was obvious, as verse 3 is going to tell us, beginning in 3. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Joseph is noticed by Potiphar. Potiphar notices that there is something different about this young man, this foreign slave. Everything he does seems to work out just fine. It seems to me that either he's the luckiest slave I've ever met, or something else is going on, or perhaps his foreign god is with him. Well, what's the big deal about the Lord being with Joseph in Egypt? Why would that be remarkable? Perhaps to us it's not, but to their eyes it would have been, because the ancients believed that the gods were local. Gods were tied to a location. So if a people were forced to flee from their home, or they left for some reason, they left their gods behind in their homeland. And yet the Lord has seemingly followed Joseph down here to Egypt. So to Potiphar, this is quite remarkable. He's thinking to himself, could Joseph's God, this person that Joseph worships, have power here in Egypt? Because after all, this is the land of the Egyptian gods. How could his God have power here? And if he does, what does that say about this God of Joseph? But there's more to the mystery, because Joseph was sold into slavery. And you would assume that if someone is sold into slavery, that their God had abandoned them, that their God had given up on them. Why else would they have fallen so low? And yet the Lord continues to be with this slave, with this Joseph. There is certainly something not typical about him. So what does Potiphar conclude? He concludes that the thing that is special must be Joseph. So I am going to use this. He's no ordinary slave. If a God decides that he wants to favor him, why would I get in his way? Why would I be such a fool as to get in the way of a God? So instead, I'm going to benefit from him. I'm going to elevate Joseph and let that favor that is falling upon him trickle on down to me. You see, Potiphar was no fool. He understood the way things worked. And when the Lord was with Joseph, he said, why don't I get in on that? So he makes him his second in command, puts him in charge of all of his slaves and all of his servants. In addition, he is in charge of all of his property and his business ventures, with authority to conduct that business on his behalf. In short order, Joseph has become more powerful than most of the free men in the world at this time. Most of the world's free individuals did not have this kind of authority and power. But that was not all that unusual. You see, aristocrats, people of high society in the ancient world, would put a slave in charge of their household. They couldn't be bothered with running such a thing. If you were a Roman, you would typically pick someone who was a Greek because of their education and their heritage, and you would have that person tutor your children and teach them about Aristotle and about Socrates and all of that. It was not uncommon. So it might seem odd to us, odd that someone would put a slave in charge of their house. But it wasn't to Potiphar. To them it was quite ordinary. And what happens when he does so? The Lord blesses Potiphar. You see, a wise man accepts the favor of a god, even one of those foreign gods, even a god of those Hebrew people. And I can assure you that Potiphar had no idea who the Lord was before he met Joseph. He had no idea who this Hebrew people was. Who were they at this time? They were just an extended family. They were a long way from the nation that they would later become in the days of Moses. They were just a family, and they're a local god. But I bet that Potiphar is happy he's heard of him now, because everything is running smoothly. Not only are Potiphar's troubles and his concerns lessened by Joseph's excellent work, but his bottom line is booming too. I think that Joseph is on his way to being slave of the month. He is the #1 guy. He is very happy with him. What's not to love about Joseph? The only thing that Potiphar worries about is what's on the menu for lunch today. Wouldn't you be happy if someone took care of everything else in life for you except for worrying about your meals? All your money troubles, all your business responsibilities were taken care of by somebody else? I think you'd love that person. I think you'd care about them a great deal. Why did I write David? That is a total fault on my Joseph's emotional state at this point. I was doing a series on Joseph back at on David, so I guess it still trickled through my mind. Think about the situation he's in. He began a few short months ago with trauma, with his brother's betrayal, with being sold as a slave to a foreign land. He must have been pretty low at that point. Maybe he blamed himself. If only I hadn't told my brothers about my dreams. Maybe he blamed his brothers, and probably rightly so. Despite his arrogance, selling your own brother into slavery, that's pretty low. Maybe he blamed God. Maybe he said, where is the Lord now? All those fancy dreams he sent me. And he was probably wondering what the future held for him. And now things have begun to turn. Now he has begun to see some success in Potiphar's whole household, and maybe now he's believing that he isn't alone again. Perhaps Joseph is now believing that even though my family has abandoned me, the Lord has not. Faith and hope coming back to life and growing stronger in Joseph's heart and mind. Perhaps Potiphar will give him his freedom. He does such excellent work. Maybe he will be free again someday. Those ideas in his mind. Things were pretty bad before, but now they're starting to look up a little bit. So you ask yourself as Joseph, what could go wrong? The Lord is with me, things are well, what could possibly go wrong? Well, here it is, verse 6, the second half of 6. Now Joseph was well-built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Well, this makes me wonder. It makes me wonder about the curse of good looks. And you might be thinking, curse? Good looks is not a curse. Good looks is a blessing. Because we spend a lot of time in our society envying the pretty people, don't we? We spend a whole lot of time on our television and in our magazines wishing we could be like the pretty people. Well, in this life, good looks may open doors, and it may help you out a great deal. But it can also bring a lot of unwanted attention your way. It can attract those who would treat that person as an object, someone for whom their good looks are only to be used. And how many of us really want to be valued in life for just how we look? And that is what happens to Joseph. He is evidently a handsome young man, and Potiphar's wife takes notice and offers him something and says, come to bed with me. You see, that is the siren's call. The call of the siren of sin, saying, take advantage of this. Our culture today is drowning in this sentiment. The idea, the offer, is that sex can be without consequences, that you can indulge in it and nothing will happen. What is the reality, though? The reality is that outside of marriage, sex always has consequences. It may begin one way, but it will eventually go bad, and it will eventually get worse, because that is what sin does. Have you ever heard of the illegal tactic called baiting and switch? A lot of stores get in trouble for doing this sometimes. They'll offer some incredible deal in their flyer or in their advertisement, and when you get there, only will you find out, oh, we're all out of that one, but we've got a different one instead. It's a little bit more. Or you'll get there and the salesperson will say, you don't really want that one, it's not that good. Get this one instead. They offer you something amazing, something too good to be true, and then they switch it to something else that's actually illegal. Sin is like that. And this is one of sin's classic bait and switch techniques. People think that they're getting pleasure, unattached, without consequences pleasure. And what do they end up with? They end up with a host of troubles. That no strings attached quickly becomes shackles that you can't get yourself away from. Shackles of responsibility in others as well. You see, Potiphar's wife offers Joseph just such a false deal. Her husband, he works long hours. Who will ever know? He's He's not even here. He's in Pharaoh's palace most of the time. And Joseph, you're a slave. Who are you to refuse her? You have no right. She said so. Go do it. That's the offer. And it's not as if there's a law against it, is there? I mean, who's to say that it's really all that wrong? That is the offer. And how does Joseph respond? Joseph responds by saying, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? You see, he begins in his explanation by saying, quite simply, it would be a betrayal of the trust that Potiphar has given me. He has entrusted me with his whole household and only withheld you, his wife. How could I take his kindness and betray him? That's the first defense that Joseph offers up. You see, he is pointing out to her that this seemingly attractive offer is false. You see, even as a slave, Joseph still respected that which belonged to Potiphar. He did not use as an excuse his condition. He didn't say, you know what, I'm a slave. I might as well get what I can in this life. That's not as if God has been good to me. In the end, all sin is rebellion against God. We don't know what Joseph was taught about the Lord at home. We really don't. But he at least knew that adultery was contrary to God's holiness. He knew that to sleep with another man's wife would be a sin against God. And regardless of other cultural or legal rules that may be against it, Joseph says, God forbids it. That's enough for me. That's all I need to know. He realized that his success in Potiphar's household was a result of God's blessing. God has been blessing me here. How could I betray him as well by dishonoring him? And so he refuses. Not only does Joseph refuse, but he is forced to stand firm. You see, it was not just one refusal that Joseph had to make. Sometimes sin is like that. It says, you turned me down once, but let's see if you can keep it up. It is persistent. It hopes to wear you down by repeated assaults. It offers it again and again and again. Isn't that not our culture that way? Sex is out there everywhere, and it's not as if you are only tempted with it once, because you're going to see it again later today. It is everywhere. And what we must do is stand firm. If we are to have victory, we must stand firm. You see, we must not only win the battle, but we must also win the war. And what is the result? What is the result of Joseph's firm stand against what he knew was wrong? Verses 11 to 18. It says, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. You see, Joseph's refusal only added fuel to her fire. She didn't stop there. You see, nothing adds appeal to desire like being told you can't have something. Anybody remember that from childhood? You didn't really want it until your parents said you couldn't have it. And then when they said you couldn't have it, you said, geez, I really want that. Life is like that sometimes. You see, denial can do two things. It can motivate you to work harder in life if your goal is just. If it is something that you should have, being refused, it can make you work harder. It can be good for you. On the other hand, it can also drive people to obsession when that goal is lust. It can drive you to difficult and dangerous decisions. And here is what happens. We have both opportunity and danger. Joseph is offered one more time the chance. There are no witnesses. Nobody is here. You could get away with it. What will Joseph do? Sin has upped the ante. Sin has said, you weren't willing to before, but what about now? Puts him in that ultimate challenge. So what does Joseph do? He runs out of the house. He wiggles out of his cloak and makes himself scarce. You see, we may want to be macho and stand up to sin and back it down and say, yeah, look at that. But the wise man knows when it's time to run. You see, as men, and I'm speaking to the men specifically now, as men, we have no business indulging in this kind of temptation. We have no business seeing how close we can get to the fire without getting ourselves burned. Because society is going to tempt you, and it is going to say, you can do this and this and this. You can get real close, and then you can say no. But it doesn't work that way. You see, the fool tries to ride the wave. The fool tries to have temptation and then say no. Tries to have it both ways. The wise man sees the danger for what it is and chooses to leave it alone and chooses to have nothing to do with it. What is the result of Joseph's wise decision? A scorned would-be lover, and she is not happy. Why do we know that lust is a lie? Why do we know that what it offers to us is false? Because it turns into hatred on a dime. Love doesn't do that. Love, when it is scorned, does not turn to hatred. Love gets hurt. But that is not what lust does. Lust turns to fury. Lust turns to revenge. What chance does Joseph have? Think about that. A powerful man's wife has just cried rape at the hands of a foreign slave. Does he have any chance of defending himself? Joseph would be lucky to escape this situation with his life. Not too long ago in our country, if this sort of thing happened, if a slave had convinced the owner, or had been accused of rape by the owner's wife, you know what would have happened? They'd have hung him. No trial, nothing. He would have been gone. So how does Potiphar react? How does Potiphar react to his wife's accusations? When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Yeah, you see, I think that Potiphar would have believed anything but this. If Joseph had been accused of stealing, Potiphar would have believed him. If Joseph had been accused of any other wrongdoing but this, I think he would have said, you know what, this is a good guy, he didn't do it. But this hits too close to home. And what is Potiphar's fault? Potiphar's fault is believing that his wife is telling the truth. That's not the kind of thing that we usually want to condemn a man for doing. Trusting his own family. His anger would have been entirely justified if she was telling the truth. Unfortunately for Joseph, she was not. And so what happens to him? He's put into prison. But that makes me wonder. It makes me wonder if Potiphar didn't entirely believe her. Because in this situation, 9 times out of 10, he would have either been sent to hard labor somewhere in the deepest, darkest place Potiphar could have thought of, or he would have simply been executed. So why does he put him in Pharaoh's prison near at hand? Something intervened. Potiphar's doubt, the Lord's intervention, probably 6 one, half dozen in the other. So where does this story go from here? You might be wondering, is this what happens when you do the right thing? Is this what you earn when you do the right thing? Look at verse 20. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. The Lord was with him. You and I might be thinking about right now, you know, God, why don't you stop being with me for a while? Because the last 2 times I was told you were with me, I ended up as a slave, and I ended up in prison. I don't think I can take much more of your being with me, God. Because from here I can't go down any further. So maybe you should just back off a bit. But Joseph wouldn't have been the only man to say that. Elijah probably felt the same way when he was running for his life in the desert. Peter might have had thoughts like that in one of his stints in prison. Paul certainly had lots of times to contemplate that sort of thing. You see, God seems to enjoy working with persecuted people. He seems to enjoy working with those who are down and You see, it is in our darkest days that we question God's presence. Most of us have no trouble worshiping God and saying hallelujahs when we have health and wealth and happiness working for us. It is when death and poverty and misery seem to be our lot that following God becomes more difficult. So how was God with Joseph in all of this? What did he do for him? He repeated the same blessing that he'd used before. Evidently, Joseph is a man with talent for administration, because God does it again and uses it again and again. And this isn't the last time God is going to do this with Joseph. Joseph is put in charge of the prison. The warden doesn't have to worry about anything. So now you have the warden sitting back, enjoying a good book, eating a donut, whatever. Well, Joseph runs the prison. What kind of prisoner must Joseph have been? You ever wonder about that? When he was thrown in prison, how did he earn the warden's trust? Well, I bet it wasn't by being bitter and complaining. And it certainly must have been by making the best of a rough situation. You see, Joseph continued to trust God even when things went from bad to worse. He was sold as a slave. He still trusted God. He was thrown in prison. He still trusted God. You see, God didn't leave Joseph hanging. He rewarded his trust and his hard work by preparing him to be an integral part of his will. But we haven't seen that part of the story yet. At this point, we don't see it. This is not the glorious part of the story. This is the part of the story where Joseph is sitting in prison. And yet he trusted God because God had a plan for him. And one day God would use him to save the lives of millions of people. But that is not this day. This day, Joseph is a forgotten Hebrew slave sitting in Pharaoh's prison. And yet he stayed true, and yet he trusts the Lord. What do we learn from this? 3 lessons that we can learn from this text this morning. First off, the lesson that Joseph knew. Sin is sin. Whatever lies it tries to tell you, there will always be consequences. Joseph knew that and walked away from it. Secondly, a godly person resists temptation and stands firm when necessary, but he also knows to run away from the chance to change his mind. Sometimes it's better off just to run away. And lastly, Joseph learned that righteous choices have to be their own reward, because sometimes the world will persecute you for them. And I shouldn't say sometimes, I should say most of the time. They are their own reward. Certainly, the Lord is